Story number 1. The Whispering Window. In the heart of a bustling city, tucked between towering skyscrapers, stood an old, forgotten apartment building. Its bricks were weathered, its windows coated with layers of grime, and its presence seemed oddly out of place amidst the modernity around it. Yet, it had one peculiar feature that drew the curious: a single, large bay window on the top floor, always slightly ajar, even on the coldest days. The building had been vacant for years, but locals whispered about strange occurrences. They claimed that if you walked past the building late at night, you could hear whispers coming from the open window, soft and unintelligible, like a conversation carried by the wind. Many dismissed it as the wind itself, or the imaginings of tired minds. One evening, Emma, a college student with a passion for urban exploration, decided to investigate. She was skeptical of ghost stories and loved uncovering the secrets of abandoned places. With a flashlight in hand and a camera slung over her shoulder, she entered the building through a rusted fire escape. The inside was as eerie as she had imagined. Dust blanketed every surface, and cobwebs hung like drapes from the ceiling. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. Emma climbed the creaking stairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. As she ascended, she began to feel uneasy. The whispers that people spoke of, it wasn't the wind. She could hear them now, faint but unmistakable, growing clearer with every step. At the top floor, she found the infamous bay window. It faced the city skyline, framing a breathtaking view of glittering lights and distant cars. But something about the room felt wrong. The air was colder here, and the whispers seemed to emanate from the very walls. Emma set up her camera to document the space. As the flash illuminated the room, she noticed something peculiar in the photos: faint outlines of people, as if their shadows were burned into the walls. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, shifting from incoherent murmurs to distinct phrases. "Help us! Don't leave!" Emma's heart raced. She turned to leave, but the door she'd entered through slammed shut, locking her inside. The temperature plummeted, and her breath came out in visible puffs. The whispers now felt like they were all around her, desperate and overlapping. Gathering her courage, she stepped closer to the window. Peering through it, she saw not the city skyline but a vast, dark expanse filled with shifting, shadowy figures. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. They reached toward the window, as if trying to claw their way into the room. Panicked, Emma stumbled back. The whispers became a deafening roar, pleading and accusing her all at once. "You have to stay. You can't leave us!" Desperate, she grabbed a heavy chair and swung it at the window. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and for a moment, the room was silent. The figures dissolved into the night, and the door creaked open. Emma didn't hesitate. She grabbed her camera and bolted down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop running until she was out of the building and back in the safety of the busy street. Later, when she reviewed her photos, she found something that chilled her to the bone. In the final image she had taken, before smashing the window, the shadows had formed a single, clear word on the wall: "Stay." Emma never returned to the building. It was demolished a few months later, replaced by yet another glass tower. But sometimes, on quiet nights, passers-by still hear whispers from where the bay window once stood, calling out to anyone who dares to listen. Story number 2. The Flickering Light. In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Lane, everything seemed picturesque. Neatly trimmed hedges lined the streets, and warm porch lights welcomed families home. But there was one house that stood out, an old, two-story structure at the very end of the cul-de-sac. Its windows were perpetually dark, except for one, a single light in the attic that flickered on and off unpredictably. The house had been vacant for years, or so everyone believed. Neighbors often joked that it was haunted, but few dared to approach it, especially after sunset. The flickering light became a local legend, with some claiming it was a prank and others insisting it was something more sinister. 12-year-old Jamie, curious and fearless, decided to investigate. Armed with his trusty flashlight and a notebook to record his findings, he convinced his best friend, Mia, to join him. "It's just an old house," Jamie reassured her. "What's the worst that could happen?" They snuck out late one evening, the chill of autumn biting at their faces. The house loomed before them, its chipped paint and sagging porch in eerie contrast to the well-kept homes nearby. As they approached, the attic light began to flicker again, as if sensing their presence. "See? It's probably just bad wiring," Jamie whispered, though his voice wavered. The front door was locked, but they found a broken basement window and climbed inside. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint scent of decay. The basement was cluttered with forgotten furniture and boxes, and their footsteps echoed ominously as they made their way upstairs. The first floor was silent, the furniture covered in white sheets like ghostly silhouettes. The only sound was the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath their feet. Jamie led the way to the staircase, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As they climbed to the second floor, they noticed something strange. Photographs hung on the walls, all of them showing the same family: a man, a woman, and a young boy. In every picture, the boy's face was blurred, as if the camera had been unable to focus on him. "That's weird," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. They reached the attic door, which was slightly ajar. The flickering light seeped through the crack, casting strange shadows in the hallway. Jamie pushed the door open slowly, revealing a cluttered attic filled with old toys, books, and a single, bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. It flickered erratically, casting the room in alternating light and shadow. In the center of the attic was a rocking chair, and in it sat a doll. It was old and worn, with a porcelain face and empty, glassy eyes that seemed to follow them. "That's just creepy," Mia muttered, stepping back. Jamie picked up the doll, curious. As soon as he touched it, the attic door slammed shut, and the light bulb went out. Darkness enveloped the room, and the air grew icy cold. A faint hum filled the silence, rising into a soft, chilling melody, a lullaby. "Jamie, what's happening?" Mia cried, clutching his arm. "I don't know," Jamie stammered, fumbling for his flashlight. When he turned it on, the beam illuminated the rocking chair. It was empty. A soft giggle echoed in the attic, followed by the patter of tiny footsteps. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment they saw a figure, a young boy, no older than 6, standing in the corner. His face was obscured, but his voice was clear. "Stay and play," he whispered. "It's lonely here." Jamie and Mia bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The boy's laughter grew louder, and the rocking chair began to move on its own, creaking rhythmically. Desperate, Jamie hurled the doll across the room. It shattered against the wall, and the attic fell silent. The door creaked open, and the flickering light bulb steadied, casting a dim but steady glow. They didn't wait to see what would happen next. Racing down the stairs and out of the house, they didn't stop running until they were safely back on the well-lit street. The next day, Jamie told his parents about the house, but when they went back to investigate, the attic was empty. The rocking chair, the doll, and even the photographs were gone. But that night, as Jamie lay in bed, he noticed something strange. His bedroom light flickered once, then twice, before going out entirely. And in the darkness, he heard a familiar whisper. "Stay and play." Story number 3. The Whispering Woods. At the edge of the small town of Pine Hollow lay a dense forest known as the Whispering Woods. Its towering trees and misty trails seemed inviting during the day, but at night, it became a place of mystery. Locals spoke of strange voices carried on the wind and lights that danced deep within the trees, but no one who ventured too far ever talked about what they found. Samantha, a recent college graduate visiting her grandparents in Pine Hollow, had always loved the woods. They were peaceful and seemed to hold secrets waiting to be discovered. One late afternoon, she decided to explore a trail she'd never taken before. She packed a flashlight, a water bottle, and her phone, just in case. The sun hung low, casting golden light through the trees as she ventured deeper into the woods. The trail was overgrown, as though it hadn't been used in years. Samantha felt a thrill of adventure, snapping pictures of moss-covered rocks and towering oaks. But as the light faded, she noticed something peculiar. The forest was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. She decided it was time to turn back, but when she looked around, the trail seemed to have disappeared. The trees looked unfamiliar, their twisted branches forming eerie shapes against the dimming sky. "Stay calm," she told herself, pulling out her flashlight. Its beam cut through the shadows, but instead of comfort, it only heightened the strange atmosphere. That's when she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible. "Help me!" Samantha froze. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, this time from a different direction. It sounded like a child's voice, fragile and desperate. Against her better judgment, she followed the sound. The flashlight flickered, and the whisper grew louder, though the words were hard to make out. It wasn't long before she saw something, a faint glow, like a lantern, bobbing in the distance. "Who's there?" Samantha called, moving toward the light. As she got closer, she saw a figure, a young girl in a white dress, standing with her back to Samantha. Relief and curiosity flooded her. "Are you lost? I can help you." The girl didn't move. Samantha approached cautiously, her flashlight trained on the figure. "Hey, it's okay," she said gently. But as she reached out, the girl turned. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with wide, hollow eyes that seemed to see through Samantha. The whisper returned, but this time it wasn't coming from the girl. It was all around her, rising in a cacophony of voices. "Stay, join us, don't leave." Samantha stumbled back, her flashlight flickering wildly. The girl's expression didn't change, but her lips moved, forming words Samantha couldn't hear over the rising whispers. Panic took over, and Samantha ran. The glowing light disappeared, plunging her into darkness. The whispers grew louder, following her as she sprinted through the trees, unsure of which direction she was going. Branches clawed at her arms and legs, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Finally, she saw it, a break in the trees. She burst out of the forest and collapsed onto a familiar road, her body shaking. When she looked back, the woods were still, the only sound her pounding heart. Samantha didn't tell anyone about what she'd seen, but she couldn't shake the memory of the girl and those haunting whispers. Weeks later, she searched online for stories about the Whispering Woods and found an old article about a missing child, a girl who had vanished in the forest decades ago. The photograph showed a smiling face in a white dress. That night, Samantha lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her room was quiet, but as she closed her eyes, she heard it again, a faint whisper, as if carried on the wind. "Help me." Story number 4. The room that doesn't exist. Alex had always been a practical person. She didn't believe in ghosts, superstitions, or anything that couldn't be explained by logic. So, when she found an affordable apartment in an old building downtown, she didn't give much thought to the strange rumors about the place. Her unit was on the 4th floor, at the very end of a long hallway. It was cozy and filled with natural light during the day. At night, however, the building seemed to take on a different personality. The creaks of settling wood sounded too deliberate, and the old radiators hissed like something alive. Alex brushed it off. It was an old building, after all. One evening, as she was unpacking, Alex noticed something odd. The apartment's layout didn't match the building's exterior. There was a blank wall next to her bedroom, but outside, the building extended farther. It was as if there should have been another room. Curiosity got the better of her. She knocked on the wall, half expecting a hollow sound. Instead, the wall felt solid, too solid. But when she pressed her ear against it, she thought she heard faint murmuring. Dismissing it as her imagination, Alex moved on. A few nights later, she woke up to a loud thud from the other side of that wall. Heart racing, she got out of bed and stared at it. "Maybe it's a pipe," she whispered, trying to calm herself. But as she listened closely, she realized the noise wasn't random. It sounded rhythmic, like footsteps pacing back and forth. The next morning, Alex asked her neighbor about it. "There's no room there," the older woman said with a frown. "That part of the building was sealed off years ago." "Why?" Alex asked. The neighbor hesitated. "It's just stories. No one talks about it much." That night, Alex couldn't stop thinking about the sealed-off space. Her logical mind demanded answers. Armed with a flashlight and a hammer, she decided to investigate. She tapped at the wall, searching for a weak spot, and after what felt like an eternity, a section gave way, revealing a small, dark opening. The air was stale, and the flashlight barely pierced the gloom. She crawled through the hole into what appeared to be a forgotten room. It was eerily pristine, as though frozen in time. A bed with neatly tucked sheets, a wooden chair, and a desk covered in old papers filled the space. As Alex moved the flashlight over the desk, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a diary. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was clear. "They don't want me to leave," one entry read. "They whisper all night, telling me I belong here." Another entry was more frantic. "I can't breathe. I can't get out. They've locked me in, forever." Alex backed away, the flashlight shaking in her hand. That's when she heard it. The door to the room creaked open, though she hadn't touched it. A shadow moved in the corner, and the air grew cold. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The whisper came next. A low, guttural sound that grew louder, filling her ears. "Stay." She bolted back through the hole, her heart pounding. She grabbed furniture and blocked off the opening, vowing never to return to that room. But sleep didn't come that night. The whispers didn't stop. The next morning, Alex packed her things and left the apartment. She never spoke of what she found in the room, and she didn't look back as she drove away. But sometimes, late at night, she'd wake up to the sound of footsteps pacing on the other side of a wall. And she'd wonder if the room had ever truly let her leave. Story number 5. The Clock That Ticks Backward. Ethan loved antiques. He spent his weekends browsing thrift stores and estate sales, looking for unique pieces to add to his growing collection. One Saturday, at a dusty old shop in the outskirts of town, he found something extraordinary, a tall, ornate grandfather clock. The clock's craftsmanship was impeccable. Its face was encased in gleaming glass, and intricate carvings adorned the dark wood. But what caught Ethan's attention was the price tag. It was almost suspiciously low. "Does it work?" he asked the shopkeeper. The old man behind the counter hesitated. "It works, in its own way," he said cryptically. Ethan assumed the clock needed repairs, but for such a beautiful piece, he didn't mind. He purchased it and had it delivered to his home. That evening, Ethan set the clock up in his living room. As he wound it, he noticed something strange. The hands moved backward. At first, he thought it was a mechanical error, but then the pendulum began to swing. A deep, resonant tick-tock filled the room. Despite the oddity, Ethan found the sound comforting. He decided to leave it as it was, telling himself it was a quirky feature that made the clock unique. A week later, Ethan started noticing strange occurrences. Objects in his home weren't where he had left them. His coffee cup would appear on the counter when he swore he'd left it in the sink. His phone would display calls he never made, with timestamps that hadn't happened yet. He blamed it on his forgetfulness, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One night, as he sat reading in the living room, the clock's ticking grew louder. Ethan glanced up and saw that the hands were spinning rapidly, moving backward in a blur. The pendulum swung wildly, and the room grew icy cold. Then, the clock stopped. The silence was deafening. Ethan got up to inspect it. As he reached for the glass door, his reflection in the clock face caught his eye. It wasn't moving like it should. It was frozen, staring back at him with wide, terrified eyes. Suddenly, his reflection began to move on its own. It raised a hand and pointed behind him. Ethan spun around, but the room was empty. When he turned back to the clock, his reflection was gone. Over the next few days, time seemed to unravel around him. The sun would rise at night and set in the morning. Conversations he'd never had played out as if they were memories. Ethan's own reflection seemed increasingly disconnected, watching him with an expression of dread. Desperate for answers, Ethan returned to the antique shop. But when he arrived, the store was abandoned. Dust covered empty shelves, and the space felt like it had been untouched for years. There was no sign of the shopkeeper, or anyone else. On the floor, Ethan found an old photograph. It was faded, but he could make out the image of the clock he had purchased, standing in a different home. Written on the back were the words, "Time always takes back what it's owed." Ethan rushed home, determined to get rid of the clock. But when he arrived, it was gone. In its place stood a large, empty space where the carpet was slightly indented, as if the clock had never been there at all. But Ethan knew better. That night, he didn't sleep. The faint sound of ticking echoed in his ears, though he couldn't tell where it was coming from. Time, it seemed, wasn't finished with him yet. Story number 6. The Missing Passenger. It was a rainy Friday night, and Mia was driving down a desolate stretch of highway on her way back from a business trip. The road was slick, and her headlights barely pierced through the heavy rain. She kept her grip tight on the steering wheel, focusing on the faint yellow lines guiding her through the darkness. Her GPS indicated that she was still 40 miles from the nearest town. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but there were no rest stops in sight. Just as she began considering pulling over, she saw a figure up ahead on the side of the road. A man stood there, drenched from head to toe, his thumb extended in the universal sign for a ride. Hesitant but unable to leave someone stranded in the middle of nowhere, Mia slowed down and rolled down her window slightly. "Need a ride?" she called out. The man nodded, his face obscured by a dripping hood. "Thank you," he said in a low, soft voice as he climbed into the passenger seat. As they drove, Mia tried to make small talk, but the man remained silent, staring out at the rain-soaked landscape. She couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was off. His clothes looked oddly outdated, like he had stepped out of another era. After a while, the silence became unbearable. "So, where are you headed?" Mia asked. The man finally turned to her. His expression was calm, but his eyes seemed distant. "Just a little further down the road," he replied. "I'll tell you when to stop." Minutes stretched into an hour. Mia's GPS signaled that she was nearing a small town, but her passenger hadn't said a word about where he wanted to be dropped off. She stole glances at him, only to find him staring straight ahead, completely still. Finally, she worked up the courage to speak again. "We're almost at the next town. Do you have a specific address?" The man didn't respond. "Hello?" she said, glancing at him more directly. But when she turned, the passenger seat was empty. Mia slammed on the brakes, her heart racing. She pulled over to the side of the road, breathing heavily as she looked around the car. There was no sign of him. No wet footprints on the floor mats. No sign that anyone had been there at all. She checked the back seat. Empty. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Had she imagined him? But she couldn't explain the water droplets on the seat, or the faint chill lingering in the air. Shaken, Mia resumed her drive, eager to reach the town. As she pulled into a gas station on the outskirts, she noticed a bulletin board near the entrance. It was covered in missing persons posters, yellowed and tattered from exposure. One photo caught her eye, a man in a dark hooded jacket. The caption read, "Missing since 1984, last seen hitchhiking along Route 37. Mia's blood ran cold. The face on the poster was unmistakably the man she had picked up. Terrified, she jumped back into her car and sped to the nearest motel. That night, she didn't sleep. The rain finally stopped, but the sound of phantom footsteps outside her door kept her awake. And every time she closed her eyes, she saw him sitting in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. Story number 7. The Shadow in the Woods. It was the last weekend of summer, and Sarah and her friends had planned a camping trip to celebrate. They chose a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from the crowded campgrounds and the noise of city life. The area was known for its beautiful trails, clear streams, and breathtaking views of the starry sky. After setting up camp, Sarah and her group sat around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across their faces. But as the night grew darker, an uneasy feeling began to settle over Sarah. "I don't like the look of those woods," she said softly, glancing into the trees surrounding their campsite. They looked almost too still, like they were hiding something. Her friend Mark laughed. "You've been watching too many horror movies, Sarah. It's just the trees." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Every now and then, she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Quick, fleeting glimpses of something large and dark moving between the trees. Around midnight, the group decided to go for a short hike down one of the trails near their campsite. Sarah hesitated but followed them anyway, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. They laughed and joked as they walked, but every few steps, Sarah felt a cold chill creeping down her spine. They reached a clearing deep in the woods, and the group stopped to admire the view. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the woods behind them. Mark turned to Sarah with a grin. "Probably just an animal." But Sarah didn't feel comforted. The sound wasn't like any animal she had ever heard. It was too deliberate, too heavy. And then she saw it. A large, shadowy figure stepped out from behind a tree, its shape barely distinguishable in the darkness. It stood perfectly still, watching them. Sarah's heart raced, her breath catching in her throat. "Do you see that?" she whispered. The group turned to look, but the shadow was gone, swallowed up by the thick woods. "Just a trick of the light," Mark said, trying to calm everyone down. But Sarah wasn't convinced. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't human. It had felt wrong, unnatural. They hurried back to the campsite, but the unease lingered. As the night wore on, the campfires seemed to flicker more erratically, casting strange shadows that danced across the trees. Sarah kept her eyes on the woods, her mind racing with thoughts of the shadows she had seen. Later, as the others fell asleep in their tents, Sarah lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. She heard the wind rustling through the leaves, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of the camp. She bolted upright in her sleeping bag, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps stopped. Suddenly, a loud crash sounded from the woods, followed by a strange, guttural growl. Sarah's blood ran cold. The sound was close, too close. She grabbed her flashlight and rushed outside, shining the beam into the darkness. Her friends were still asleep, oblivious to the danger lurking just beyond the trees. And that's when she saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring directly at her from the shadows. Frozen in terror, Sarah couldn't move. The eyes slowly began to move closer, and then the figure stepped into the light. It wasn't a bear or any animal she had seen before. The creature stood nearly 7 feet tall, with pale skin stretched taut over its skeletal frame. Its mouth was wide, twisted into a grotesque smile, revealing rows of jagged teeth. With a snarl, the creature lunged forward, but just as quickly it disappeared into the woods, leaving Sarah alone in the eerie silence. The next morning, Sarah and her friends packed up quickly, eager to leave the woods behind. As they drove away, Sarah looked out the window at the trees, her mind still racing. She was certain of one thing: the woods weren't empty. And whatever was out there was still watching them, waiting for the next group of campers to wander too deep into the forest. Story number 8. The Lost Cell Phone. It was the end of the semester, and Tyler and his friends were excited for a weekend road trip to a remote cabin by the lake. They'd been planning the getaway for months, looking forward to the chance to unwind and disconnect from the stresses of college life. The cabin was secluded, far from the distractions of the internet and phone signals, and that was exactly what they wanted. As they arrived, the sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the lake. The cabin itself was rustic, surrounded by tall pine trees and dense underbrush. There was something peaceful about the place, almost too peaceful. "Perfect," Tyler said, grinning as he opened the door to the cabin. "No distractions, no worries. Just us and nature." The group spent the first evening relaxing around the fire pit, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. They talked about school, their futures, and the latest movies. But as the night deepened, Tyler noticed something strange. His phone, which had been working perfectly fine on the drive up, suddenly had no signal. At first, he thought it was just a fluke. They were in a remote area, after all. But as the hours passed, Tyler realized he couldn't get a single bar, no matter how hard he tried. Eventually, everyone else noticed the same thing. Their phones had no signal, no connection to the outside world. "It's like we're cut off from everything," Tyler said, trying to brush off the unease creeping into his mind. As the night wore on, everyone went to bed, but Tyler stayed up a little longer, staring out the window at the dark woods surrounding the cabin. The wind whispered through the trees, and the occasional rustle of leaves made him uneasy. He couldn't explain why, but something about the night felt off. The next morning, Tyler woke up to the sound of his friends laughing in the kitchen. As he stretched and got out of bed, he noticed something strange. His phone was missing. He checked the bedside table, his jacket pockets, and even the bathroom, but it was nowhere to be found. "Hey, did anyone see my phone?" he asked, starting to feel a little panicked. One by one, his friends shook their heads. "No, man. Haven't seen it," Mark said, looking up from his breakfast. Tyler was sure he'd left it on the nightstand before bed. He had a vague memory of putting it there, but now it was gone. He looked around the cabin again, searching every nook and cranny, but it was as if the phone had disappeared into thin air. "Maybe it's just lost somewhere," Sarah suggested. "It could have slipped under the bed or something." But Tyler felt uneasy. He was certain that the phone had been there when he fell asleep. Something about it didn't sit right. He decided to go outside and look around the cabin, hoping to find it in the grass or near the porch. As Tyler stepped outside, he immediately felt the weight of the silence in the air. The forest around the cabin was still, and the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent. It felt almost empty. He walked around the cabin, scanning the ground for any sign of his phone. That's when he saw something strange. In the dirt near the edge of the woods, half buried under a pile of leaves, was his phone. Tyler's heart skipped a beat. He knelt down to pick it up, but as he did, he noticed something odd. The screen was cracked, as if it had been dropped from a great height. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The phone was still on. As he unlocked it, he saw that there were several new photos and videos on it. Photos of him and his friends taken while they were asleep. The pictures were blurry, but it was clear that someone had been right next to them while they rested. Some of the photos even showed strange, shadowy figures standing near their sleeping bags. Tyler's skin crawled. Who had taken these photos? He checked the videos next. The first one was a shaky, dark shot of their cabin, taken from a distance. The second video was even more disturbing. It showed someone entering the cabin in the dead of night, quietly stepping around the sleeping group. The camera zoomed in on each of them, lingering for an uncomfortably long time on their faces, before it slowly moved toward the door. The final video was the most unsettling of all. It showed a dark figure standing outside the cabin, just on the edge of the trees, watching the cabin. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Tyler could make out the outline of a man, tall, thin, with long, scraggly hair. Tyler dropped the phone in horror. He turned to run back to the cabin, but as he did, he caught a glimpse of movement in the trees. Someone, or something, was watching him. Panicked, Tyler rushed inside to tell his friends, but as he opened the door, he found them sitting motionless, staring straight ahead, not a word spoken between them. Their eyes were wide, locked in a trance. "Guys!" Tyler shouted, shaking Mark by the shoulders. "Snap out of it!" But they didn't respond. The only sound was the eerie whisper of the wind outside. Suddenly, Tyler heard a faint, familiar sound, the sound of his phone ringing. He turned around, and to his horror, the phone was ringing on the kitchen counter. It was the same number from the photos and videos. Tyler ran out of the cabin, leaving his friends behind, his heart pounding. He didn't look back. Whatever had taken his phone, whatever was watching him from the trees, wasn't human. And Tyler knew he needed to get as far away from the cabin as possible. But as he reached the edge of the woods, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. It was the shadowy figure from the video. Story number 9. The Whispering Willows. It was a hot summer afternoon when Mia and her friends decided to take a hike through the old forest behind the town. The path had been worn down by decades of travelers, but not many people went there anymore. There were rumors about strange happenings in the woods, but Mia and her group were skeptical. They just wanted a quiet day in nature, away from the hustle of modern life. "Are you sure we should be doing this?" asked Jake, looking up at the darkening trees with unease. "I've heard some weird stuff about this forest. People say it's haunted." "Oh, come on," Mia laughed, brushing off his concerns. "It's just a forest, Jake. We're only hiking for a couple of hours. What's the worst that could happen?" The group of 5 pushed forward, ignoring the chill creeping in as the shadows grew longer. The further they went, the quieter the forest seemed. The usual sounds of birds and rustling animals were missing, replaced by an eerie silence. "This is starting to feel off," Sarah said, glancing nervously around the trees. "Where is everyone? We haven't seen any other hikers in a while." Mia, always the adventurous one, smiled and shrugged. "That's just part of the charm of the place. It's peaceful." As the sun began to set, the trees seemed to loom higher, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers in the sky. The path narrowed, and the air grew heavy with humidity. They pressed on, determined to reach the clearing they had heard about, a small, peaceful meadow in the middle of the forest. When they finally arrived, it was breathtaking. The clearing was bathed in the soft, golden light of the fading sun. Wildflowers dotted the grass, and a small brook ran through the center of the meadow. It seemed like the perfect place to relax. But as they set up their little camp, Mia noticed something strange. There were small, strange markings on some of the trees surrounding the meadow, symbols that looked ancient and worn by time. She tried to ignore it, telling herself they were just carvings made by someone in the past. As the night descended, the group gathered around the campfire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. The conversation eventually turned to the legends of the forest, the whispers of strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions that were said to haunt the area. Sarah was the most skeptical, laughing at the idea of ghosts, but even she couldn't deny the odd feeling in the air. "Has anyone noticed how quiet it is?" she asked, a little unnerved. "I mean, no crickets, no owls. It's like the whole forest is holding its breath." "Maybe it's just the time of night," Mia said, trying to sound confident. "Forests get quiet sometimes. It's nothing to worry about." But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She kept hearing what sounded like faint whispers, as if the wind was carrying voices through the trees. She turned to the others, but no one seemed to notice. Later that evening, as they prepared to go to bed, a strange thing happened. Jake was walking back from the edge of the clearing when he stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" Mia asked, approaching him. Jake didn't answer. He was staring at the base of one of the trees, his face pale. I saw something moving in the woods. A shadow. It was huge." Mia frowned, feeling a sudden coldness in the air. "Are you sure? Maybe it was just an animal." Jake shook his head. "No, this was different. It was like it was watching me." The group grew uneasy, but no one wanted to admit they were scared. They decided to gather their things and head back to the trail, thinking they had spent enough time in the strange forest. As they made their way back along the narrow path, the whispers grew louder. At first, it was just a murmur, a sound that seemed to come from all directions. But as they walked deeper into the woods, the whispers became clearer, more distinct. They were no longer just the wind. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking to them, calling out their names in soft, eerie tones. "Mia," the voice whispered. "Sarah. Jake." They all froze. It wasn't just in their heads anymore. The voices were real. "Who's doing that?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking. "Who's messing with us?" But there was no answer, just more whispers, each one growing louder as they walked faster. The trees seemed to close in on them, their branches creaking like they were alive. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, Mia's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, hoping to call for help, but the screen was blank. She tried again, nothing. "Great," she muttered, shoving the phone back into her pocket. No signal. They finally reached the edge of the forest, the whispering still following them. As they emerged into the open, the voices abruptly stopped, leaving them in an unnerving silence. The air felt thick, oppressive. "What the heck was that?" Sarah asked, looking around in confusion. "I don't know," Mia said, shaking her head. "But I don't think it was just our imagination." They hurried back to town, the unease still gnawing at their minds. That night, Mia couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the whispers again, soft and persistent, just on the edge of hearing. The next morning, Mia returned to the forest with her phone to take some pictures of the area. But when she arrived at the clearing, everything was different. The trees were still there, but the meadow was gone. The place where they had camped, where they had heard the voices, was now just an empty patch of dirt. It was as if the forest had erased everything that had happened. Mia never went back to the forest after that day. And every time she walked past the edge of the woods, she could still hear those faint whispers calling her name.